Hello friends, in the series which we are doing on history of India from 1750 to 1950, today we will talk about the peasant and the tribal movements. And as we know that how British rule during that particular period was responsible for the various kinds of atrocities on the various groups of or the sections of the society, including the peasants as well as the tribals. And because of the colonial policies, we found that these groups repeatedly in a way rebelled against the colonial rulers during the course of different centuries, beginning from different points of time, and their concerns were related to either the subsistence patterns in which British tried to trap them in that sense, or rather we find that the peasants they rebelled because of the various land revenue settlements which were introduced by the British. So we find that these kinds of issues they were reflected in the various kinds of peasant and the tribal movements during the colonial period. So we'll talk about some of the movements during this particular period concerning the peasants as well as the tribals, and what were the reasons behind such kind of movements, and how these movements they were being repressed by the colonial rulers because they did not want that any kind of a situation might arise because of which their rule in India is destabilized. So in that sense we find that the colonial rulers they talk about the various kinds of they took into account the various kinds of concerns of the Indians, and then thereafter they in a way reciprocated. And many a times we find that in the initial period with regard to the tribals as well as the peasants, we find that the colonial rulers they handled them with a lot of oppression, and because of which we find that there was a lot of resentment and discontent against the East India Company. And many of the historians they have argued that these movements were pre-political in nature, they were spontaneous and unpremeditated. But it has also been rejected because some of the scholars, the recent historiography, it argues that they were in that sense premeditated, and they had a lot of political consciousness as well, and they could be seen as some kind of a political issues. And their concerns of the people, those who were in a way revolting against the British in that sense, they also reflected this kind of an idea. And they say the recent writings they argue that they were well thought out and planned, and the political considerations which were there they were also very important. And we find that how the peasants they revealed the basic understanding of the relationship of domination and subordination, and this kind of a relationship was a political relationship as well. And when you talk about these kinds of aspects, it was a political consciousness, and any task to revert it or subvert it is a political task, as has been argued by some of the scholars. And we see that how the various kinds of the policies of the East India Company in the framework of the revenue reforms, and how they tried to affect and alter the Indian rural society. And the high revenue demand, as I told you, was one of the East India Company's concern, and it wanted to secure more and more revenue for itself. And the various land revenue settlements, whether the permanent settlement, Rajatwari or Mahalwari, all these three settlements, we find that the main issue was to acquire more and more revenue for the government. And we find that how the rural population got affected due to it, how the British they had that kind of a ruthlessness to secure the land revenue for themselves, and this led to some kind of a situation where violent protests could be seen. And we also see that how land control and authority they also changed during this particular period, and various kinds of land tenures, as I have told you, they also underwent some kind of a change. And when British they introduced these kinds of policies, we see that how land became some sort of a sellable commodity, because of which many times we find that how peasants they were also being evicted from the land. And this kind of a triumvirate of Sarkar, Sahukar and Zamindar was in a sense detrimental to the interests of the common peasants, and we find that the kind of policies which were followed by them with regard to the railway construction as well, which led to destruction of a lot of forest areas, and how tribal life was affected when the forest areas they were being secured by the British for their own use. And we find that over a period of time, British wanted to convert a lot of forest areas into the reserve forest areas, so that they are the sole custodian of that particular region, and they are able to exploit those regions for their own benefit. When we talk about the various kinds of movements during the colonial period, we find especially some of the scholars like Kathleen Gough talks about the various kinds of categories with regard to these kinds of movements, and we find that restoring the traditional authority and agrarian form of life was one of the concerns of the restorative movements. And Rudrangshu Mukherjee has also talked about the restoration of the traditional and moral universe of the peasant society as well. So that was one kind of a category in which with which Kathleen Gough makes us aware, and apart from that she also talks about the secondary movements in which the emergence of a new form of leader claiming the messiah status in the revival of a golden age was talked about, in which we find that some of the movements which were there at this point of time, in which the leaders they claimed that they were the messiahs, and their followers they also argued that they were the messiahs and they will bring some kind of a golden age during for them. So these were the secondary movements, and then we find that thirdly, the more current in the European movements than the Indian movements was the social banditry, which we generally don't find in the Indian movements. And at the same time, the next one was the violent plots and attacks by which the individual landlords, money lenders and officials they were being attacked by the peasants and the tribals. So we find that these kinds of movements which have been categorized by Gough in various kinds of categories. And the next one was the mass upsurge, which was of two kinds. One was a reformative with large upsurge base, which contained some of the reformist features like Bhagat movements of Bihar that helped to raise the lowest status of the peasantry. And the secondly were the transformative, which fought for the total transformation of the society and showed the millenarian elements, though in many of them past is glorified as well. So we find that these were the five kinds of movements in which Kathleen Gough has classified both the peasants and the tribal movements. And apart from that, we also see that some of the scholars they have also talked about the ideas of primary resistance, and how the first phase of traditional unmodified form of the traditional structure and the secondary resistance was a millenarian movement. So in that sense, we find that how the idea of modern resistance, as they were directed to destroy the political power and were anti-imperialist in nature. So Eric Stokes has talked about from that particular perspective, and we see that other historians they have also argued in different frameworks. And when you talk about in terms of the peasant insurgency, then we find that how the established notions they were to be changed, and the relations of power which were there at that point of time they were also being questioned, so that in a way the justice was to be enforced from the point of view from that particular point of view. And how then when people those who were engaged in such kind of activities, then those kinds of activities definitely would be classified as some kind of a political movement, has also been argued by Ranjit Guha. And we see that the idea of political consciousness and the peasant risings, how they were also being connected, and the political movements were to be publicly announced, and how Santals they announced these kinds of things. And then the new apparatus of power in that sense it destroyed, and the attacks were also collective in nature as well. And we see that during the initial part, that is 1750s to 1850s, before the revolt of 1857, we find that a number of revolts involving peasants, they were there, and how Kathleen Gough talks about them and calls the restorative as enemies in that sense. And these enemies were the British officials and the troops and British plantation owners, the revenue agents, pro-British landlords, money lenders and police. So, this shows the peasants, they resisted the colonial rule and not just the whites in that sense. And that was one of the important aspects, because any kind of an authority, whether zamindar, sahukar or any other kind of authority, police, etc., they were being resisted by the peasants in that sense, and how the form of control was attacked rather than just the foreigners, because they were utilizing the Indians to in a way perpetrate that kind of a violence on the Indians. So, we see that how the various scholars, some of the colonial scholars or historians, largely they describe them as a conspiracy of the disgruntled leaders who misled masses to join it. And this view was in a way rejected, and because if a peasant he goes to rebel, he does not go because of the misleading, he goes to rebel keeping in mind that the state is very powerful and can cost him his livelihood and life. So, a lot of thought goes in the process of the revolt, and it is taken as an ultimate resort. So, just it cannot be argued that these peasants and tribals, they were being misled and then they joined the these kinds of revolt. And when one talks about the specific cases, then we find that one of the dispossessed zamindar Raja Chet Singh, and how he had the support of the peasants of Banaras and also Awadh as well. And we find that this kind of support was mobilized through the zamindari type of leaders to restore the zamindari. And scholars like S.B. Chaudhary argue that the insurrection of the deposed Nawab of Awadh, Vizier Ali, in 1799 has all the appearance of a national revolt, like the revolt of Chet Singh, supported by the large bodies of people, both Hindus and Muslims. So, we find that how the various kinds of revolts in different regions of India, definitely they have been in a way studied by the various scholars, and they have given their arguments with regard to that. And various kinds of factors, they were also very important. And when we find that, when we talk about some of the revolts which were happening in the southern part of India, then how the Polygar uprising in Tirunelveli area was a zamindari revolt, as leaders and the members were the zamindars, and how East India Company treated them as zamindars holding the military service tenures. In local peasant societies, they were regarded as sovereigns inheriting power from pre-Muslim Vijayanagar kingdom. And Christopher Bailey has argued then when resisted to East India Company troops, they were supported by local peasants and were treated as folk heroes as well. So, we find that how many times how peasants they sided with the zamindars as well, because zamindars and peasants they shared some kind of a relationship, and many times they felt that the British rulers they were also mistreating the zamindars as well. And in this context, we find that such kind of a support of the people or the masses to them provided some kind of a credibility or legitimization to these kinds of protest by these people. And for example, the uprising of Velu Thampi, who was the PM of Travancore state, who commanded a large army of professional soldiers and peasant volunteers as well. And these armed rebellions were put down eventually by the British army, which was comparatively huge, and they all used all sorts of repression and suppression to in a way control these kinds of activities. And we find that in some cases rebels were later reinstated with more lenient revenue terms as well, when their concerns they were being heard by the colonial rulers. So, colonial rulers they resorted to various kinds of tactics initially to in a way oppress and suppress any kind of a revolt. And we also see that how British, largely as has been argued by Kathleen Gough as well, they were suppressed with exemplary savagery. So, British in that sense always wanted to impose their authority. They wanted to show to the Indians that how they were the superior force and how the natives, they had to obey them at all levels, and their command was to be followed. So, this kind of a discriminatory treatment to the Indians by the British and their racial policy, in that sense, where Indians, they were treated with all sorts of disdain, was also one of the reasons for such kind of peasant and tribal revolts. And we find that when such kind of things, they were happening, then at that point of time, these people, they realized that British definitely were their enemies, but at the same time, the people, those who were imposing them, the Indians, those who had been recruited by the British, they were also being attacked by the natives. And we find that how in different regions of India, such kind of protests, they could be seen in the framework of the peasants and the tribals. So we realize that the British methods, they were being employed in all the different regions of India, and whether the revenue settlements, they were different in different regions for that matter. But even then, the kind of operation which was there in all these revenue settlements was quite big enough, in that sense, or it created that kind of an impact, that how the people, they wanted to in a way come against the colonial rule. And in that sense, when we see the Rangapur rebellion of 1783 in northern district of Bengal, it was also seen as an example of opposition, and peasantry was oppressed by the revenue contractors and the East India Company officials, how they imposed the high revenue demands and collected the illegal cesses as well. And in that sense, we find the revenue contractors unleashed a reign of terror in these regions. And when we find that these people, they in a way appealed for justice, they were not taken care of by the colonial rulers, and when they raised army, they equipped themselves with the primitive weapons and attacked the local kachari, which was the court of law, and looted the grain stores and released the prisoners. So they wanted to take upon themselves that how the justice should be given to them, but how these people, they were being denied justice by the colonial rulers, and that was one of the major concerns of that time. And we also see that how during this particular period in different regions, Hindu and Muslim peasants, they fought together and stopped paying revenue as well. And the rebels, they wanted to in a way legitimize their movement by invoking what Sugat Bose has called the symbols of pre-colonial state system, and they called their leader Nawab, started their own government and levied charges to meet cost of their movement. So that was one argument, that how the various kinds of symbols of pre-colonial state system, and they were being assumed by the people, those who were now want to control the government from their perspective, or from their own level. And they in a way asked for their own government, that their government is own in that particular region in which they had rebelled, and they also wanted to have some kind of a charges to meet the cost of the movement which they had initiated. And we find that when this movement happened, then Warren Hastings sent troops to put down the rebellion, and the brutal suppression was followed by some reform in the revenue farming system at that point of time. So we find that British, for that matter, wanted to keep their revenue sources open. They wanted in a way that after all sorts of suppression, some kind of a respite should also be given at times to the people, those who were engaged in agricultural operations. And we also find that how in different movements in different regions, how religion also played an important role, and it provided some kind of a discursive field within which peasants understood the colonial rule and conceptualized resistance as well. And we find that how it defined their ideology of protest as well, where we see in the framework of sannyasi and fakir rebellion, it rocked the northern Bengal and the adjacent areas of Bihar between 1763 and 1800. And the sannyasis, who were known for their martial art traditions, they were involved in the land holding, money lending and trade in raw silk, piece goods, broadcloth, copper and spices. So we find that how religion importantly was seen during this time, how it was also playing an important role. And during the Mughal period, we find that Madari faqirs, they enjoyed the rent free tenures, and they retained the armed followers during the Mughal period as well. And we see that these armed faqirs, they are affected by the East Indian Company's high revenue demands, resumption of the rent free tenures and commercial policy as well. And despite that, how these people, they in a way revolted against the British, because they realized that their interests, they were not being taken care of by the British rulers. And they were in a way negatively affected by the various kinds of policies which were followed by the British, and how they wanted to secure more and more revenue demand for themselves, and how the various kinds of commercial policy which were followed by the British in the sense of the various goods which were coming to India, and how the raw materials, they were being going out of India. And we also see that British, the way they treated the Indians in a racial kind of a policy or manner, was also in a way rejected by people from different sections of life. So we see that how during these kinds of movements, we also see that people from different strata of the society, they also joined these kinds of movements. And remarkable philosophical affinity between the two religious orders could also be seen during this particular period, and how this kind of a mutual relationship and the organizational network, and how communication with the followers, they all of them, they facilitated the mobilization of the rebels. And this was happening in some of the movements during this time, and how rebels, they were also getting support from their own co-religionists for that matter, or the kind of philosophical affinity which was there between the two religious orders during this time. And this kind of a mutual kind of a relationship definitely helped them in that sense. And we find that it also created some kind of a conflicting kind of a situation, and conflict could be seen. And we see that how East India Company was not willing to tolerate the wandering armed monks, challenging its ideal of a settled peasant society in Bengal, and that would regularly pay revenue without resorting to any kind of a resistance. So British, they were also very clear with regard to what they wanted in that sense, and they did not wanted any kind of armed monks in the society, and they wanted that more and more people, they engage in the settled peasant community or society, and how they could secure more and more land revenue for themselves, so that their desire to fill the British coffers which were there in Britain, and at the same time secure more and more areas and revenue for themselves in India, so that they can also increase their own personal wealth, as well as we have seen in the cases of Warren Hastings and Robert Clive, that how they made a fortune. And they were not the only two, there were several of them, but they were the only two those who were implicated. So in that sense, we find that all these kinds of things which were being done at that point of time with regard to suppressing the revolt of in different regions of the various movements which were happening at that point of time was a serious kind of a concern for the British. And how the people, those who were in a way involved in these movements, they realized that how colonial rule was a threat to them. So we will talk further about these movements and their impact in our next lecture. Thank you very much.